This episode of the Central Valley Music Educators podcast is sponsored by J.H. Tackett Marketing in Hanford. They offer worldwide printing at your fingertips. Find out more at jhtacketmarketing.com.
Welcome to the Central Valley Music Educators Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Bentley. On this week's show, I'll be speaking with Poulan about sight reading. You can follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, Google, YouTube, or wherever you download your favorite shows. You can also listen on our website at cvmepodcast.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Poulan, who is a longtime music educator in the Valley. He's also a composer, having written works for concert band as well as DCI. He's here today to speak about a passion of his, which is musical literacy and sight reading for band. Welcome to the show, Key.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking very forward to this podcast and then seeing what all we end up doing and helping out the local music educators in the area.
Yeah, so let's jump right into it. We've got festivals coming up in March and April, and I know all of our educators are anxious to hear some of the tips that you have for sight reading. Let's go.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think I need to lay a little bit of groundwork, and I think it's very important. And one of the things that I did with Buchanan High School in particular, this is where I really refined the system and everything, was to develop a strong sense of fundamentals. You know, students being able to be musically literate in particular, understanding everything there is to know about time signatures, key signatures, working their scales, being proficient on their instrument at their level. And I think that's really important. You can have a great deal of proficiency at the appropriate level. And so I think that's very important to start with. So you don't want to throw something that has crazy multimeter changes at them if they've never experienced those. So there's a lot of fundamental training with rhythm exercises and, of course, the circle of fifths and all the scales and various things like that. So to me, that's the key ingredient to being a literate musician. You just need to know the alphabet before you start constructing words and sentences and so forth. So in terms of sight reading, I really enjoy looking at the piece as a whole. One of the things that I always start with is to review the roadmap. Does it go A to Z, or is there a DS al coda? What kind of things happen in the piece? And have the students actually physically touch the music and find out where, there's a DS right here. Place your finger on the DS, go back to where it is, and continue. There's the coda jump. Go on and place your finger there. Actually, if there are any kind of little hang-ups that could possibly happen, I think that's important that they at least know where they are. I always tell students, a right note in the wrong place is a wrong note, guys. So you have an 8.33% chance of hitting the right note if you're in the wrong place. But, rhythm is obviously very important. I do like to discuss the form of the piece. For instance, I even like to just break it down. Is it a song or a dance? Or maybe it's ABA. Maybe there's a driving section at the beginning, and then, of course, something lyrical in the middle and driving at the end. That's a lot of the sight reading pieces are constructed that way. And once they've done that, then I like to dig right into the time signatures. Let's look at the time signatures, understanding what the pulse is. For instance, if it's a 6/8 a time signature, we need to understand is it a fast 6/8 or a slow 6/8. How does that feel? Are the groupings of 3, for instance? Obviously, a lot of the ones are either in 4/4 or 3/4 time in a lot of the sight reading situations when you're at contest. So again, kind of going through the time signatures, the students really need to understand that they have a responsibility of that lower number of the time signature. They need to understand that. And that's like, the theory that you need to be teaching the students in case they encounter something like this, especially in a festival situation, to where they don't suddenly their eyes are wide open and it's deer in the headlights. So understanding the time signatures, looking and identifying tempo changes. For instance, a lot of times things will be roughly, let's say it's 120. There's obviously, you can sit there and go, okay, just think Stars and Stripes Forever from John Philip Sousa. Get that in your head. 120. And, various other little pieces like that can certainly help for certain tempi throughout the piece. Again, a lot of the pieces in kind of like that grade 2, grade 1, they're going to be pretty consistent with tempi. It starts to change up, and if you're sight reading grade 3 or grade 4, obviously there will be a lot more of that sort of a thing happening. And certainly, like in your classroom, the more advanced grade 5, and if you tackle a grade 6, obviously there's a lot to do. But you do want to make sure that the students have the most success reading through the entire piece in terms of just the mechanics of how the time signatures work and the tempo changes. The next thing that I always like to do is have students take a look at the key signature. And this is a place where I really like them to touch the page once again. I think touching, obviously, a lot of the lower ones are probably going to be in the key of B flat, most likely, with maybe 5 or 6 different pitches that are utilized throughout the piece. But I still like them to do that. And when they do that, we go through the score and we look to see, is there a key change? So what I enjoy doing, and since you're not allowed to, sing or count or anything like that, I like the students to take their instruments and finger the scale that it is. And some students are quick enough to realize, oh, that's the key of G minor, not B flat major. But anyway, as long as they're fingering whatever the major scale is, or if they recognize, oh, this is minor, okay, let's do that. Then I have them work that scale, just fingering the scale up and down a couple of times, because I think that's very important. It's like, okay, here's the muscle memory that you're going to be using. And then especially if they add a flat, suddenly we're in the key of E flat. I think it's very important to physically touch that added concert A flat. And if they do that, they already have a better shot. I'm just hedging the bet, right? They have a better shot at doing it correctly the first time, just because the kinesthetic learners not only touch, but they see it as well. So whatever type learners you have, it's always better to hedge your bets by having as many possible variations to where it resonates with those students. So once we've done that, so we understand the roadmap, we know the time, if there's tempi changes, anything like that, what key we're in, suddenly we already have a pretty good understanding of the piece. And then what I really like to do, if there is an accidental somewhere within the piece, I really like them to touch that accidental and take a look why that accidental is there. Publishers back in the old days, when they used to print music elsewhere, I know we do a little bit of both now, but, they don't want to waste ink. And so composers, too, will put those accidentals in there. And sometimes that will be a situation where it's like, okay, this is just a courtesy accidental for the students. But sometimes they don't. So I think it's very important for students to look at that concert A flat, for instance, and back up and look at where it's an A natural, because that's where things go wrong. They all of a sudden are, they're just worried about, surviving through the piece of music, and you want to see what they could do to hedge their bet on a successful performance. So that's one of those really just a little trick of the trade. Then I like to have the students analyze the most challenging rhythms. And, certainly when I teach rhythm and, to my students, it's always, I look at what the skeleton rhythm of a piece is. That kind of goes back to the time signature. if it's 4/4, we call that 4/4 time or common time. I always say, okay, the skeleton rhythm is 4/4 notes, per measure. That's the math. 4/4 notes. If it's 6/8, there's 6/8 notes in the measure. There's your math. If it's 25/16, there's 25/16 notes in the measure. And
come on, 25/16. Come on.
I've never had to sight read it, but the point is, I go to the absurd level. But suddenly it's like, oh, okay, it's not so weird. I just tried to simplify the concept. Cut time, which is 2/2, 2 half notes per measure. And we count those 1, 2. So having them really understand how all of that works with what I call the skeleton rhythm, it gives them a better shot of surviving through a sight reading a piece of music. I really enjoy having the students look to see that they're usually grouped in 2s or 3s. So bada beat up, bada beat up, bada beat up. 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3. And if they look at the odd meters that way, they can really start to feel and notice that all of a sudden you're starting to give it a little bit of a lilt. There's a dance quality to it when I have the students look at the groupings of 2s and 3s. If it's 4/4 time, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and they're getting that, 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. They understand that it's very up, down and up, so to speak. So having them look at different groupings like that, I think is very important. So I like to have them isolate for their instrument what is the most challenging rhythm, and take a second and look at that, analyze it, think about everything that we've discussed on how you count and how you figure out rhythms within the context of the tempo. That's very, very important. Slow 6/8, is completely different than the fast 6/8. So I think it's really, I can't stress enough, it's important to set the foundation so they can be successful readers. Again, you wouldn't have a kindergarten student try to read a paragraph if they don't even know the letters of the alphabet. And I always go back to that, because it's like these are building blocks, and you can take time over the course of their musical career, certainly in the middle school and high school levels. Obviously, it starts at the elementary with a lot of them. But I think having some daily drills, it doesn't have to be much, but just a little bit, where they're constantly having to either sight read rhythm or a small phrase. I think that's really a good technique. So they're reading every single day. It can be an 8-bar phrase. It could be a chorale. It could be, one measure. For instance, I always like to start with the whole note at the high school level, because that's a rhythm that most people don't play very well. A lot of people will cut the note off way too early. It's like, oh, it has to touch count 1. If you give me $1 and I'm supposed to make change and give you 4 quarters for that $1, you don't want me to give you 3 or 3 and a dime. You want that exact math. And so I try to kind of incorporate, obviously, the other parts of their education, certainly talking math in this situation. So I like to have them isolate and kind of look through those rhythms. And then I kind of go back and review the style of the work. Again, during the form, I think it's very, it's pretty easy to, again, most of them are ABA or A. And in a lot of the sight reading situations. But that doesn't necessarily talk about the style. So if it does dance, that means that certain notes are going to have more weight than other notes. And the groupings, like I'd mentioned, like any odd meter, things like that, the first note of the grouping is usually the heaviest note in that particular bar. I always like to relate things back to animal farms, where all animals are created equal, but some animals are created more equal than others. I just did a conference down the SCSBOA conference, and I have a little graphic where it's called Clarity Field instead of Animal Farm, where all notes are equal, but some notes are more equal than others, especially of the same rhythm. But I think that applies. That's what causes music to dance. And even if the slower lyrical things, there are certain notes that have more emphasis. And if you put the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable, it can be very, very interesting when you get right down to it. So students know they can see the groupings. And these are things that I kind of wish I knew way back in junior high and high school. And I had some great directors. But once I decided to kind of develop a fundamental program, it really helped me to okay, I need to keep this as simple as possible so they understand. And that's, I have a basics program that I use a lot that deals with all of those fundamentals. So the style of the work, to me, that is everything, because we can all just play. Let's say you play the right note, you play the right rhythm. They're all in the right place. They're all together and everything. And that can be a musical bore. And I think that's where we really want to take things just beyond the technical, mathematical rhythm. I want students to know that it's got to be an emotional experience, and not just a personal emotional experience. That's fantastic. And that's what we want you to get out of it, is to enjoy that emotional connection. The best part about being in a band, for instance, is that you are working together with a lot of other people. Obviously, the conductor is the one that tries to hold it all together. So the chairs have to be set a certain way. The stand height has to be a certain way, so you can be really successful and have that communication from the player to the conductor. But that's just to hold the ensemble together, and that's so you can make some music together with the conductor and go on his cue. Or if people are lost, to here's where we are. Here's letter 25 or number 25. I think it's really, I think it's really important that students understand it's not just about them, and it's certainly not about the band director. It's the audience who you're playing for. And the coolest thing that we do is we transfer emotion from ourselves through music to other people, and we get them to understand exactly what we're feeling, and even give them the option to feel however music makes certain people feel. Some people really, they find great joy, they find sadness, everything. And I think all of these technical aspects limit you to a certain place. And that's where I kind of get back to the whole idea with it's the style of the work, having certain notes that have more weight than others. So it does dance if it's a dance, or if it's a lyrical, if it's a song. We don't want just whole notes just sitting there and doing nothing. Everything has to have that forward horizontal direction, that horizontal flow. And there is a point in a phrase that's the peak of the phrase, and we need to make sure that we are keeping our energy up. There may not be a crescendo written underneath it, but you can certainly tell by and feel it if you work harmony, in your band situation. It's really fun to sit there and that chord leads to, there it is. There's the resolution. And so getting students to understand that there's an emotional experience where we're going to, and not just hitting it and backing away, but landing on it and slowly fading away. I'm kind of thinking like in a 4-bar phrase. And I actually try to do this in my own music. I will have a 2-bar crescendo, and then a sustain, and then a one-bar decrescendo. Because most students can do a crescendo. If they have to listen, they have to know their balance, how things are within what they do. They're pretty good at doing that. And then if they know that they have to sustain, let's say that third measure of a phrase, and then let the fourth measure taper. So it's up for 2, sustain, down for 1. What the audience hears is up for 2, gentle down for 2. And it's just one of those things, because most students, especially junior high and high school students, they have a tendency of tapering too quickly.
Yep.
And that, yeah.
I was reviewing that very same thing yesterday with my group.
Right. And the fact that that's something that we all work on. Hopefully, we all work on that. We just don't want the music to die. And certainly there's fadeaways, but even as you fade down to absolutely nothing, there's still that forward direction, and there's your core is engaged to really quote support the sound. The core has to be engaged through the release point. And so again, that goes back to fundamental teaching, and just reinforcing those certain things, I think, can really just make a huge difference in terms of the emotional aspect. So I'm kind of touching on, like, to review the phrasing and the musicality of the work, which is kind of the next thing after style. We understand, okay, this is a song or a dance. These notes have more weight than the others, blah, blah, blah. Don't let the lyrical line die. We need to go to this chord right here and measure 17. That's going to be the peak of that particular harmonic moment. But then looking carefully at the phrasing and the musicality, and style and tempo does not dictate dynamics or musicality, or vice versa. For instance, you could have you could see like little accents on da 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 da. There's that quiet energy that happens. You still have more weight than others, but it's just not loud. And it can be fast, it can be slow, it can be lyrical. So again, they need to understand that. And then if you've had those discussions in the classroom, they know how to relate to that within the sight reading component of any festival or just any rehearsal, anytime you sight read. The next level of things that I like to talk about is identifying the primary versus secondary voices. And this may be controversial. I don't think it is, but it was really interesting. I presented an inverted pyramid at the SCSBOA conference. And it looked really strange because it's like, okay, there's 40%, which is melody, and then 30% counter melody, and then I think 20% is rhythm, and the remainder is just kind of bass tones. And that always kind of blows people's minds. It's like, okay, aren't we supposed to have more bass in the bottom of the sound? And what I'm referring to is just what lines need to speak the most. We all know the pyramid of sound. We need more low end than we need high end, and that's a beautiful texture. That's a beautiful, like, organ quality texture, and that's something that we like to go for. However, I look at that as playing with primary colors, red, blue, and yellow. Okay. That's one sound out of a band. It's a gorgeous sound, and it's fantastic, especially for chorales and things that are more lyrical, but not all instruments play it, all the time. It's not 100%, here's your chord and this is what we want this to sound like. The beauty of what we do is we have zillions of colors that we can get. And this is all going to come back to primary versus secondary versus tertiary. But I think when it gets down to texturing, I'm just going to throw this out because this is one of the things, I think this is the absolute best part about conducting a band when they know the music, is able to bring out this part versus that part. Let's say you have a trombone, a tenor saxophone, and a bassoon. And they could be playing a unison note. And if you want it to be more warm, you're going to have more trombone in the sound and a lot less tenor, and then even less bassoon. So that's these are all in the tenor range. But you can still start to manipulate that in that situation. And I do like to use that as a demonstration. Then I have them inverted. I said, okay, we want it to be a more reedy texture. Let's have the bassoon bring more of their note out, and then tenor sax, and then trombone, and do it that way. Suddenly, it's a completely different texture with the same three instruments. And then I do it once again where the tenor sax is a couple of times. Tenor sax is primary and so forth. in doing that, all of a sudden, the students' ears are starting to open up to that whole concept of texturing. And to me, that's what, beyond, that's why you guys have to have your notes, all this lower level stuff, notes, rhythms, style, even all of that. Obviously, there's intonation involved in that. But here's where we come in and we really get to work as an ensemble and listen around. And see, I think
listening, that's the thing, is the ears,
yeah.
Using the ears is something you really have to stress.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I get really excited when I talk about this stuff, but getting back to where we were on the whole sight reading thing, I think it's important to go, okay, here's the kind of textures that you want to get in this section and that section. They can be really quick. It's like, okay, guys, this is a full ensemble chorale. They know what to do. But there may be moments where they can pick and choose otherwise. But getting to like identify the primary versus secondary voices, again, that's where I use that inverted pyramid, where it's like, we need to hear the melody. If you don't hear the melody, you've kind of lost the idea. And it's not just necessarily a moving note. For instance, like if the melody, if I say whatever the dynamic level is, it can be piano, right? We want to hear 40%. Let's say everybody's playing. You want to hear 40% melody. You need to hear the melody. And then if there's moving parts, that's a secondary kind of a thing. We definitely want that. If there's a driving rhythm underneath, we need to be able to still feel that drive and feel the bass underneath that, but it doesn't need to cover up the secondary or the primary voices. One of the things I'd love to talk on your show about is my experience in both the street. I taught at Merced, and we did that a lot. Actually, I learned all about the parade thing, and then I do some judging as well. And it's really interesting how we don't think about who the audience is in sight reading. It's for the person, the 1 to 3 judges that are there. Usually in Central Section, all the years, LJ over when he was at Kingsburg, he was retired, but he was the guy that used to always do the sight reading, and it was just like, this is for LJ. Okay, this is a room. We don't want to overblow this room that we're in. We're in the Reedley band room, and it can be you can just overpower the person that's evaluating you. So you have to think the audience. Same thing in like the parade situation. You've got to know where the judge is, and you need to listen from there and close your eyes and quit watching them and listen. Make sure that the percussion doesn't just bury the band the closer they get.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, all this applies. I just that's a freebie out there for any of the listeners that do parade. Please think about where it is and stand there and close your eyes and listen to the music. Again, it gets back to listening.
Yeah, we're going to have you on the show in a few weeks. We have a parade special coming up probably in March or April. We had talked about doing fantastic. That. So that's going to be great. So let's get back to the sight reading. So you get to the point in the session where the students are able to ask questions. What kinds of questions should you encourage your students to ask?
A lot of times, sight reading music is brand new, and there could be issues with the parts. For instance, if there's anything that's confusing, I think that's the first thing, just to make sure. I think one of the tricks or let's call them tips. Tricks sounds just so wrong, and it's not. But knowing that if there's a trap, I call them traps. A key change. An accidental that comes out of nowhere, something tricky, to have one of the students get clarification on something like that not only helps that student, it helps the students around them. And I think that's really important. This is something I really want to make sure we all take a look at. At least everybody in the clarinet section needs to know this. Oh, there's a subito piano right there in measure 3. Okay. Hopefully they understand that's suddenly soft. But if not, clarification on any of those kinds of things. And I don't think there's time in the Central California festival, sight reading festivals, to do this sort of a thing. I grew up in the Texas system. You had mentioned before that I was from there and I taught there. And so I grew up with this whole thing. We had a pretty substantial, I mean, I think it was a half-hour window, but we had the opportunity to conduct through the piece of music. And I think it's really important. Let's say there's a rallentando. I want all the students to look. It's like, okay, we're going at march tempo, and then we're going to slow all the way down. We're going from 120 to 60. So watch, and that's going to happen over 2 measures. Okay, let's watch. Okay, so I would conduct that, and in that system, we were allowed to go, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, kind of a thing. You could do that where they understand the subdivision and they're thinking subdivision as they slow down. Again, I know that this is. Certain things aren't allowed on these current sheets, but certainly in your classroom, I think that's a very reasonable, way to go through the process. In the UIL system in Texas, you'd be able to conduct through the piece, and all the students, they could finger their parts. Slides moving on trombones. That was always, still to this day. Okay, trombone players, let's see your slides moving as we're doing this. But it gives them an opportunity to kind of feel the mechanics of some of the things that they're doing. And since they can't vocalize, the students can't sing their parts, they can't do that, but they could still vocalize inside their mouths silently. And they could do certain things while we're doing essentially what would be a silent run through of a piece. And it was more about the conductor showing tempo, students knowing where we are in the music, and being able to at least get that initial fingering situation, to be able to finger through all of the parts. I think it's really a great tool before they actually do the performance. Now, again, I realize, I want to say that I understand that certain things you can and cannot do. I wouldn't tap the rhythm. I see that that's one of our rules here. To me, that's not really sight reading. You want the students to be able to interpret, again, the mechanics of the math, to be able to do that. But I do think it's really nice and helpful when you can conduct through a certain aspect of the music, especially if there's a tempo change. Another tip is I've heard stories of people that have yelled out rehearsal numbers, 25, but there's ways to do that with both hands and being very clear. Here's the next section in case someone's lost. Let's try to get them back on the train and on the track. And, I think that those kind of little tips really help quite a bit. Certainly working with your band on, the larger my conducting pattern gets, that's indicating obviously a volume change, or if I get very small and I bring things in, or if I hold my hand up toward the snare drummer that didn't realize that, you're not playing above carpet right now. So everything that you're doing is overbalancing the band. So understanding when you hold up a hand like for less, that they have that reaction. Again, that's where setup is so critical. I think I'm a stickler for every student having their own individual stand, to where there's always the best potential communication from the player to the conductor and vice versa, to where there's never an issue. Front row usually has their stands down too far. I always like to tell them, okay, let's lift that stand up. I want you to put your instrument in playing position, and I want you to look at your bottom staff on the piece of music, and then I want you to imagine where, if you were burning a laser through that, where would it land? Would it be anywhere near the conductor? So don't be afraid to lift those up just a little bit. You don't want to hide behind them, but you do need that. You want to hedge your bet when it comes to communication. And that's from director to player, player to director, directors getting their heads out of the stand and up and being able to communicate with every musician, I think is critical.
Yeah, it's amazing when you tell a kid that they can move a stand a few inches or it actually raises up, and they go, I didn't. It's so funny when you do that. So raise the stand, and it's funny because it's so portable, and they can totally do it. It just as well middle school here, but sure, I'm sure absolutely. It happens in high school everywhere. As well. Yeah. just music stands are made to be moved.
Yeah. Well, the way that I would always approach sight reading too at festival, first of all, I think it's very important. Actually, any performance, like on stage, for instance, I think that you should come in an orderly manner and not just, haphazardly do it. I always like to have the back row come in and everything, and I like them to remain standing and then make the adjustments to their stands so it's set up like we are set up in our band room. Some people like the really tight horseshoe kind of a setup. I like more flat arcs because I think we get more of our emotion directly out to the audience that way, as opposed to the ends of the horseshoes where they're kind of playing across from each other. To each his own. But I really like to have what I call flat arcs, and trying to get this band kid at this high school to set up exactly how you like it in your band room will never happen. So before the students sit down, I would always have them adjust your chair, adjust your stand where, okay, now let's all sit together. And then, or if there's a missing stand, I mean, I've seen that happen before. It's like, we're not going to put you in a terrible performance situation because you don't have a stand. There's probably some right off stage, and there always are. And so they set those up, and I think it's critical. Same thing with percussion. You don't want to have like suddenly, oh, the timpani are over here now. I wonder why they're, just to make sure the percussion is absolutely set up, especially with their stand height and the angle of their instruments, so they can really communicate. Again, it's about the communication. It's about having fundamentals in place, so when you say something, they understand what to do. And I think using a lot of these, little tips of the trade, I think that's a really solid way to actually educate students. Again, I'm a huge advocate for music literacy. It didn't matter what the style was. I wanted my students to be musically literate, so they would be great at, wind ensemble, which is my love. And then, of course, we had killer jazz bands with Paul Chagoyan. Same situation. It was like we all approached music literacy the same way. Guess what? We could learn our marching band music pretty quickly because they were musically literate. And to me, that's really what matters most, especially when you pass them off out into the real world, whether they're going to be, a band director or a professional musician, or if they just like to play in their church or whatever. They have the tools they need. And I think that the whole sight reading practice idea is really solid, and it gives students what they need to continue in music. And to me, that's the goal of any high school band director for sure. It's like they have the ability and they have the knowledge there, and they may not have the chops if they're 20 years down the road, but they know what to do.
All right, Key. Hey, thanks for those tips and tricks. For our listeners, I'm actually going to take this handout, and it will be available on our website show notes. You can download the PDF copy for yourself and follow these 15 tips for sight reading. Key, I want to thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for all that you do for the Central Valley.
Well, I tell you, I appreciate it so much. You could tell I was pretty much winded by the end, but I'm very, very passionate about this particular subject because this is where everything comes together. And any of the listeners out there that needs any kind of help, I'm always available, and I would love to share my passion with anybody that wants to dig in a little bit deeper.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. I wanted to let everyone know that the Casmic Preview episodes went so well that CMEA has invited me to record a special episode during the conference at their booth in the exhibit hall, Friday afternoon from 1 to 3 and Saturday morning from 10 to 12. Stop by to jump on the show with me and share your conference fun, or just stop by to say hi. I'd love to see you there. I'd like to thank JH Tackett Marketing in Hanford for sponsoring this episode of the Central Valley Music Educators Podcast. If you're interested in sponsoring a future episode of the show, or you have a show topic that you'd be interested in hearing about, please contact me at cvmepodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving a review, sharing on social media, or telling a friend. For more information about the show, you can visit us on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube at Central Valley Music Educators Podcast or at CVME Podcast. Have a great week.